I wanted to do this demonstration because I've had a lot of calls about how to put the brackets on, where to put them, why do you put them there. So I figured this would be the best way to do it, to bring a frame where you can actually see what's going on in person. And if you got any questions, I'm going to try to answer them first and try to answer them on the car while we're talking about them. So if anybody's got a question on the Watts brackets on how to install them, I'll take your questions now.
Is there a certain length on that bracket you made from the mount to the rear end on the red bracket on this side? The trailing arm?
This right here?
Yeah.
I normally shorten them 4 inches from a stock 80s.
Okay. I'm new to this and I'm actually doing this weekend, so I was trying to make it.
Yeah. The biggest thing is where you want your rear end to sit. I make everything where it pulls it forward, so it keeps the sheet metal out of the back of the tires longer.
Okay, so like a slight angle backwards then.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
See, and then another thing that I was going to tell everybody, when they put these in, I normally set these up where the pinion angle is up. I look at everything, so when you start out fresh, it's going to look weird, but when the car is completely junk, everything will be the way it's supposed to be from factory. Because the drive shaft, the U-joints are actually made to run on an angle, so that's not going to hurt on this, that, and it keeps everything up off the ground. So if you run over a bumper or anything like that, you're not going to worry about it grabbing your drivetrain and ripping your drive shaft out or something. And then
And you said on the trailing arms, they're just the stock length?
the lowers, I shorten them 4 inches also.
Okay,
And I normally try to put the lower pretty much in line with the factory outside lower. So it's kind of a reference there. Which on this one I set it up about 1.5 inches, 2 inches back to make it look like it's factory. And then with my arms, the way I normally put them, it pulls it up 1.5 inches, which angles everything up. And that's another thing, when you're setting up the rear end, when you put your brackets on, you want to have your frame sitting at right height. Because as you move the rear or the frame up and down, the pinion angle goes up and down. So if you set all your brackets on with everything sitting up with no shocks on it with springs in it, and you suck it down to right height, everything's going to be off. Because I don't know if I can do it in here on this one, but just if you watch the rear end, see how it goes up and down. So that kind of helps keep everything out of your way. So I plan on, once the car is completely bent, bellied out, and the belly's dragging on the ground, my drive shaft isn't touching the ground. It's up in the tunnel where it's supposed to be. And then, kind of like on the control arms, you can make them longer and put it back from where it is factory. But I try to suck everything as far as forward as possible and keep it where it's universal, where no matter what tire you run, it'll still work. But if you want a specific design just for your car, the tires you run and everything, call me and I'll give you instructions on how to measure everything, and then we'll build a set just for your application.
I know we bought the regular kit with the bolt ends and the arms, and then we just had to make the arms.
Right. Anybody else got any questions?
So you have, so I've seen some Wattsling kits, they go to the first hole, like the one there.
Right here.
Down. Is there a mechanical advantage or anything with saving the humps or anything by doing them?
The biggest thing, kind of like this bracket here, my brackets are roughly 6 inches long. So if you take that bolt where it's in the bracket and you put that bolt there, your weld's starting here and coming all the way back to here. Them cars normally want to suck in right here. So that's why guys do that. Well, the only bad thing about that is a lot of places you run won't let you put it there because that's a bend point. And that's a factory hole and you can't close it up. So that's why I tried to stay in the factory position, just to keep it where it's, no matter where you run it, it should be legal. The control arms, I went with the 1.5 by 2.5 because it's roughly the same size as a factory. It's not bigger, it's not taking up more space. That way you should, I mean, in all reality, if it wasn't as thick as they are, you could almost run them in stock class because there's some control arms they make now that are actually tube with just the bushings on it.
Right.
Just because the time it takes to form and stamp stuff rather than drill a hole is a lot quicker.
Now, could you run it like it is on the left side there without the bracket?
You probably could, but I mean, even if you take a piece of 14 gauge, 1/8 inch, and just bend it and weld it, that'll work. The only reason I made these like this is so if you had to, I actually make these where they're bolt on. So I drill 2 holes here, and then you just bolt them on from car to car and not have to worry about it. Because there's not a lot of stress on that bracket itself. It's all on the bolt. And with the bushing, there's not a lot of stress on it at all. Because you got a bushing here and then a bushing in the back. Any other questions?
Does the coil spring matter? Which kind?
Depends on if you're running different control arms. Because the spring pressure, if you're chaining your rear end down, that spring pressure transfers into your control arms.
So it varies from building.
Right.
Okay.
It's just about everything. I mean, every set of rules in every class, everything could possibly be different. Just because like a stock car, a rear end like this with just a little simple brace on it would be plenty for a stock show. Because it takes, I mean, if you're running stocker rims, you let the rims bend, keeps all the stress off your rear end. Because even on my mod cars that I run now, I don't run full centers normally, I run the small centers. Any other questions?
Are you still making the conversions for Cadillacs?
Yes. Those are pretty much call to order because I have to custom hand make them because there's so many bends in them and I haven't had time to actually go through and have them programmed. So, if there's anybody else got any questions?
What's the warranty on it?
The warranty on the brackets, I give a 1-year warranty on the welds and the construction and material. If there's any defects, that if it rips or cracks, I'll replace any bracket for free. The control arms, as long as you don't modify them, weld anything to them or change them, I'll warranty the control arms for a lifetime of you having them. So if you break your control arm, I want to see it so I can make my product better and fix that problem that you had, because if you had it, somebody else is going to have it. That's pretty much where I've designed all my parts, because if I've had a problem with it, I take it and I fix what I have a problem with it and run it. And then I might have a problem with it, or sometimes it works out good, but most of the time you always have a problem with something because you don't look at the little things. The bushings are lifetime warranty as well through energy suspension, as long as they're not melted or cut or anything like that. So basically you buy these control arms, you only got to buy them once if you don't add anything to them. And these control arms, I've had guys use them in 80s cars. It pulls the rear end way forward. I think there's a guy here that was telling me that. But these control arms specifically for the Watts kit, I've only used them on the Watts control arms, or the Watts brackets. So when you order a Watts kit, it'll only fit 03 and up to I think 12, I think is when they quit making them. And then the 80s control arms, 98 up, correct. And then the 80s control arms, there's a lot of guys that would rather have the 80s than old iron. So a lot of them guys just buy the 80s control arms because I shorten the lower to change the pinion angle like I was talking before to where it picks it up. So you can bolt a factory GM rear end in an 80s car and it picks your pinion up. So you don't have to worry about rotating the brackets on the rear end to get your pinion angle where you're supposed to, because a lot of places that require a stock rear end, you can't weld on the rear end. So, and then the old iron is a little bit shorter on top than an 80s, longer on the lower, just because their brackets are set up different. And that was another thing I wanted to touch on while we're talking about old iron and stuff like that. My brackets are designed for an 8/8 rear end. So if you take an 8/8 out of a square body, you can run these brackets, and I've found some stock control arms that are short enough out of other vehicles that you can run stock control arms if you're allowed to run these brackets and run a stock rear end. So my brackets are actually set up wide enough where it'll fit just about any bushing, the control arm that's out there. And if they're too wide, you can just shorten the actual center pin with a grinder. Also the adjustment on the uppers was the one big thing that I've had a lot of calls on. Guys get these brackets in the mail, you unwrap them. What I normally do is I take the control arm, bolt it in the bracket like this. Don't tighten it, just finger tighten it. And I send these with the nuts on them so it keeps the threads from getting all messed up. So you'll take this bracket and you'll put this, there's 2 3/4 holes in the package tray on the front. You'll just take this, put it up in there. Just tighten this till it's finger tight. And you'll come back here. And that's another thing. I put these Allen head studs on the front. So you can take an Allen wrench, if you don't over tighten it first. These are 1 1/8 bolts, or nuts, so. And then you can take that, see how it just kind of wiggles like this? You take your bolt, well, it never works as easy as you want it to the first time. You're hooked up to a machine. And normally when you do these, I try to put these on the rear end. That's probably the easiest way, so you don't have to fight the bolt, because basically when you tighten this up, it pulls the control arm forward. So I just showed you a lot of the problem everybody has on trying to get them hooked up, because these are very, very easy to install. Let that pin go. There it is. So hook everything to the rear end. There, get it out of here. There we go. And I actually tell people when they put these in to bolt them to your rear end. Do the uppers first.
Right there.
And then you can take these. Once you got the uppers in, frame. Nice. Anyhow, when you put these in, you'll take your, if you got a T-handle Allen wrench, stick it in the back of that, and see how that adjusts up? Pull it tight with your hand till it fits really up in the flat part of the package tray. You put your nut on it, tighten that up. Once you get that done, you'll have the lowers in the bottom already with the brackets on them. You really don't have to put the brackets on them. But you pull the lower up, stick the bolt in the control arm, and then take your rubber mallet, where you get that about where you want it with your brackets flush on the bottom of the frame, and just smack the bolt, and it'll leave an imprint on the frame. These don't have to be dead nuts, guys, because you get hit a couple times, the frame's gonna bend, stuff's gonna move. So if you're within reason, it's not gonna matter. I take a tape measure and pull from the axle tube to a factory bracket or seam. So that gives you a definite measurement so you know you're straight on the bottom. And then put your bracket up there, stick your bolt in it, tighten it to the frame, weld it on, and then take your bracket or your control arm out of the rear end, put it in the frame bracket, and then pull it up and put it in the rear end. Other than that, they're pretty much bolt and go. Once you put these in here and tighten your nut up, take a Sharpie or a drill bit, or even take your torch and smack a hole in it. Blow your holes here, tighten all of them up, and you're pretty much ready to go. I like to set these up at a ride height, roughly give or take 11 3/4 to 12 inches from this right here. And that's pretty much where these were designed to sit. So like after the heat race, when everything's flipped up and tight, you want to suck it down to get your ride height back where you want it. That's where these come into factor. When your car is flipped and ready to go, that's when these start to play in. When you first put them in with shocks in them and springs, they're standing way up. You take your chains, pull it down to get your ride heights because that keeps your shocks from overextending. That's the biggest part about running chains. You can use them for other things, I'm sure people do, but the biggest thing to run a chain is to keep your shocks from overextending, because when they do, then your spring falls out.
Where do you measure that, 11 to 12 inches?
These flat spots right here on the package tray, that's normally where I set ride height. I give myself about 14 inches to the back rails. I set my jack stands there. Normally you got the front suspension completely done. That's another thing I wanted to talk on. When you put these in, you want the tires you're going to run, the springs you're going to run, and everything. So when you set it up, everything's the way it is when you run it. Because if you set it up with bigger tires on it and stuff like that, when you put all your tires on it and set it down, everything's not set up for the way you wanted it. So when you do your watts brackets, you want to make sure your front's completely done. Sit these in there, bolt them up, and then you just take the lowers, pull them forward or backwards to set your pinion angle. I think factory's roughly 7 degrees if you buy an angle finder at Harbor Freight or whatever. Just stick it on your pinion. As long as you're at least 7 degrees up, you're plenty. I go a little bit more just because if my stuff's laying flat on the ground, I don't want my drive shaft to be rubbing. Other than that, you can use like this one. This is actually a rear end of like a 97 I put drums on. You can actually use a sway bar and everything. So everything's pretty much, you can use factory if you want to, you can use aftermarket, but the brackets are set up to use aftermarket or any regular control arm.
So if we're talking rear ends, it's a good place to chain one on 98 plus like that.
I like to go right here at these little cuts in the frame, being they're already open. Instead of causing another hole, I just open these up. Because I figure if you're pulling down and back, your humps normally want to go down and forward. So you're fighting all that.
Did you hear that, kids?
And that's another thing, if you're running stock control arms and you're chaining your car down, all that pressure is on your control arms. And if you have a great big heavy rear end and that rear end's planted on the ground and you get hit, your frame goes and it's got to drag with your control arms to pull that rear end. So that's another thing, if you're running a stalker show and you got to run stalker arms, you might want to look into building a stalker 8-8 or something like that, because Nerat sells hub ends. They sell 35 spline spools for these. They're about the cheapest rear end you could build for what you're running in a Ford. And then you get a housing in every car you buy. So if you bend one, you cut the tubes off, clean them up, put them back together. I don't think there's anything that I haven't touched on. Oh, also the bolt placements. When you put your bolts in your brackets, these bolts on the inside go in this way. These bolts out here go out this way, because your shock, when that starts moving, your shock will actually start rubbing them bolts. So if you put the head towards the back and the nut towards the front, that gives your shock clearance for the bracket.
What's the benefit of a shock? Is there a reason to run a shock on a rear end?
Wheel hop. You got them big heavy tires that aren't balanced. That thing's jumping up and down like this. That vibration goes all the way through your car. So every nut and bolt in your car is getting that same vibration.
What if I had a filling I wanted to fall along? Should I take the shocks off?
You're gonna feel it. Also, reusing the brackets. These brackets on the top will bend. They're only 1/4 inch. I made them 1/4 inch so they will flex and bend with the car. You keep all that bracket straight, then you're putting all the stress on your bolts and your control arms and your rear end. So everything needs to move. Put a piece of all thread in the holes on the brackets. Put a nut on the inside of both sides and just tighten that nut up and it'll spread it open. if you squeeze it too tight or if it gets bent. The back plate, they're gonna bend out or in. Just set them up there, tighten them up by hand, get them freed up, put your bolts in there and tighten them up. They'll pull back to the frame and tighten up. The lowers, take your control arm bolt out. If you can't get it out, cut around the bracket, take it off, put it on the bench, take your bolt out, and then cut the frame off the bracket, and them are reusable as well.
Since he's new to this toast and he's getting ready to do this in about a week, so he's right here. He's listened to everything you've said. He's right there. Now he's got his coils. Now he's got his shock. What next from this point?
So basically, once you get your brackets in, you got everything bolted and tightened, put your shocks in, or your springs in, then you put your shocks in. If you're allowed to run chains, you want to put your chains in and tighten them up. I don't know if you can chain your car down on the trailer, but you want to take some of the stress off your shocks. So when that car's bouncing up and down on the track, you're not pulling on those seals and that stem of that shock, it's on the chain. Other than that, on a stock car, you don't need any more tension than that, unless you want your ride height, and then you can change shocks and get different heights on shocks where they're overextended all the way, but they're shorter. So instead of it being, if you can't run chains, that's another way to control your ride height. Because they make shocks for about everything, and if you're allowed to change shocks, you might as well go to the parts store and say, care if I go back through your boxes and pull them out, push them together, and see what you got.
So he's ready to put his coils in. He jacks the back bumper up all the way, rear end's hanging, and he looks at that coil like, how the piss is that supposed to go in there? Then what?
So when you do your spring, one of them will go in real easy, about always. You might have to push down the rear end. But once you get it in there, you go to this side, won't fit. So you want to jack this side up, all the way up, or if you ain't got a body on, take a ratchet strap, suck this side as tight as you can get it. Jack this side of the frame up, and that spring will almost fall in there. You might have to put a bar on it and kind of plop it in there, but that's the easiest way to get your springs in. And then you just, if you have to put your shocks on, you ain't got no help, you put it on your car trailer and strap it down, pull it down with your shocks. Or you can put a ratchet strap around the whole package tray and ratchet strap it down. I like to weld nuts right here on my rear end and then drop my all threads through here to get my ride height. And then I can set everything up. And once I'm done, I just pull them all threads back out.
So you put the springs in with the shocks on or off?
Off. Put them on the top so you don't got to mess with the spring where you're bolting them up. But kind of like these, I brought some springs with me, but we had to use a pry bar to get them out, so that's kind of why I took them out before I got here. So, but other than that, you just jack this side up and let the rear end hang, push it down, pop your spring in, and then this side, jack it up. If you have to, strap this side down, because it will fight you to get this side in, definitely if you're using bigger springs.
How many big show wins you got with your brackets like that, just under your belt?
I couldn't tell you. I mean, I know my brackets have won every national show out there. Vegas, there was in the Cadillacs that won. They won Blizzard Bash, Mayhem, Spring Explosion, Bash for Cash. I mean, I couldn't tell you actually, because I've sold brackets from California to New York to Canada, Mexico.
That'd be a cool trophy wall to see.
Right. But other than that, in a nutshell, it's pretty much bolt on. If you got any questions or want something custom for you, if you're a little bit more on the competitive side and rather your stuff be a certain way, I try to tell people go buy some 1x1 wood, drill a hole in it, put it up there where you want your rear end, mark it, drill a hole in it, and measure center to center. Send me the measurements and I can build your control arms. If you want them for like a Cadillac that's got bushing, we can do bushing. I mean, we've made dirt track cars, I've made motor mounts for front wheel drives. I mean, the options are endless. If you can think it, I could probably build it. But that was another thing on these studs here. Don't use an impact on them. They're not meant to hold anything. They're hardened studs and they're welded on, so if you put a whole lot of torque, they probably will break off. But those aren't designed to hold anything structurally. Those are just for aligning your rear end up to make it easy. The hole's 3/4, so we use a 3/4 stud to make that work. So just kind of like I was saying, use your Allen head to get your bracket lined up where it sits flat on the package tray. Crank that down with the wrench, and you shouldn't have to touch it again, because even if it comes loose, it's not going to matter.
Yeah, so we got a show coming up where you're allowed to bolt 2 bolts through the package tray from your gas tank protector. Would it be okay? I mean, obviously it's manipulating your product and everything like that. Is there any benefit to going through the Watson kit?
Yeah, you can actually, the 4 bolts on the bracket, I'll take it back off and it's not bolted on, I'll show you guys. So these have got 4 bolts on them. Leave this bolt out when you're building your car. Because all these bolts, like I was mentioning earlier in the inside, you run that way, and that was for a purpose. Because if you run a mod car, you're allowed to push your gas tank protector all the way back against the frame. Well, that's where these middle bolts come in handy. Like Bash for Cash and places like that, you're allowed 2 bolts to bolt your gas tank mount. So you leave these ones out and run them all the way through your mount, put it in there, and then tighten them up with this. And then this is basically making your cage holding your rear end where it's at. And I will warranty these arms if you bend one, I promise. Because if you guys bend it, I want to know about it, that way I can fix my design. Other than that, when you bolt these up, I send longer bolts. If you look their way out here, tighten these up till they run out of threads. That way the shank of the bolt is actually in the metal of the bracket instead of the threads. Some guys ask if they should shim this out. You can if you want to. I tighten them up till it squeezes, till it's tight, because it's still got a little bit of room. Because you want everything to move and flex, because you're getting hit at 20 miles an hour in the wheel. If the rear end don't flex, that's going all on your wheel and axle bearing studs and all that stuff. Any questions?
How do you determine which shop to run? You have to
That's just personal preference, really.
Ask Toby Highland.
Yeah, I couldn't give you no part numbers. I normally go to a local part store that know me, and they let me go back there and pull out till I figure out what I want, and as long as I don't make a mess. And that's normally one thing. If you go to any part store that you're local to, that you go all the time, 9 times out of 10 they'll let you go back there and go through the shelf as long as you don't make a mess. That's kind of like tire shops. If you're looking for stuffers, 9 times out of 10 they'll let you go through a trailer as long as they don't have to pick up your mess. So it don't hurt to ask. That's like anything. Rules, parts. Ask. If you got a question, ask. Don't be ashamed of anything. I don't know everything, and I've been doing it as long as I can remember. I'm learning something every day, so. Any questions?
If you run a stock show with a slip-in drive shaft, with your pinion angle up, you run the yoke tight in the tranny, or you leave it smooth?
I normally use about 2 fingers. 3's kind of pushing it. But that's another thing when you're making your drive shaft, you want your car sitting at right height and on the ground with the weight of the vehicle on it. Because when you lift it up, the rear end comes forward. When it goes down, the rear end goes back. Because I've had guys build drive shafts on the lift before, sit it down, go to a derby, make one hit, and drive shaft fall out. But other than that, the key points, bolt everything to your rear end, pull the bracket up, smack it with a hammer, free up your top ones, mark them up. If you want a key measurement, normally there's a pinch weld on the inside of the rails. Normally that's visible on both sides. You might want it farther forward, you might want it farther backwards, but that's kind of a good starting point. Other than that, I think pretty much covered all the control arms parts. I think that's it.
All right.